Welcome everyone. We're just going to give it a few minutes here as our participants continue to file in. Okay. All right, welcome everyone to our first in our webinar series, Producing Robust Livestock Through Nutrition, Genetic, and Soil Health Management. Today, we will be listening to Dr. Vander Ley as he presents Building Resilience in Your Herd Through Nutrition. I am Rebecca Kern, Ward Laboratories professional animal scientist, and before we get started, I just have a few housekeeping items. First of all, if any of you guys logging in here are professional animal scientists, each webinar in our series is worth 1 continuing education credit, so make sure you get those. Secondly, any registrants who also attend, you have to actually attend, all 4 webinars will be eligible for 1 free near-infrared plus mineral analysis of your forages and some ward gear. So that's some incentive to join in the next following webinars. For your questions through this presentation, feel free to type them in the chat box or in the Q&A box. And Dr. Vander Ley will also go through with you how to use Slido. He's going to be using Slido to do some polls with you guys. So you have several options there, and we'll try our best to answer your questions as we go through the presentation. And finally, all of these webinars are recorded, and a link will go out via email to all registrants afterwards. And you can also visit our YouTube page to see this and other webinars in the series. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Vander Ley. Dr. Vander Ley grew up on a small diversified farm in South Dakota. He completed his undergraduate studies at Doert College in Sioux Center, Iowa, and went on to attend Iowa State University to earn both his Doctorate of Veterinary Medicine and PhD. Dr. Vander Ley's PhD dissertation research focused on population diagnostic tools for bovine viral diarrhea virus. While completing his post-DVM education, Dr. Vander Ley also completed an internship with the Iowa State University Food, Animal Medicine, and Surgery Service and served as an emergency food animal clinician. Following his PhD, Dr. Vander Ley worked at the University of Missouri as an ambulatory food animal clinician. He taught field-based food animal medicine and surgery to veterinary students while serving clients with a wide array of livestock species. He also conducted research aimed broadly at mitigating bovine respiratory disease. In December of 2016, Dr. Vander Ley accepted a position as the veterinary epidemiologist at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Great Plains Veterinary Education Center. His research at the GPVEC is focused on improving cattle health and performance through understanding and eliminating disease. Currently, Dr. Vander Ley's research efforts are focused on congestive heart failure in the feedlot and developing herd-level surveillance tools for common bovine pathogens. Dr. Vander Ley lives near Sutton, Nebraska with his wife, Katie, and 3 children, Garrett, Gavin, and Johanna. So without any further delay, I will allow you to share your screen and get us started, Dr. Vander Ley.
Thank you for the introduction. Give me just a second while Becca, can you stop sharing so I can a minute, please? Thank you. Let's try that again. Becca, can you confirm that my my presentation is on the screen?
Yes, your presentation is on the screen. Yep.
Excellent.
First slide.
Thank you. So as Becca said, we're going to use an audience participation system today called Slido. So if you are watching this on your phone, it might be a little bit challenging to do both watch the presentation and do Slido. But if you're watching on a computer and you got a smartphone handy or you got some other kind of device, if you wouldn't mind, grab that other device and go to slido.com or just Google Slido and click the link. You should come to a screen that looks like this one right here. And where it says enter event code, just enter Ward, and it should take you to the screen that looks like this, which is the one we're using for today. So I'll give you just a second to do that. Here in a minute, we're going to do a practice question, and I'm going to just have you tell me where you're from. So I'll advance. Again, you can go to slido.com and just enter Ward. And this screen right here is how we practice using it. It's how I know people are getting on. So I'm going to sit here until we get a few people logged into it. It's looking good. You guys should be able to see the results as they can come in. So we got a few questions coming down the road later. As you can see, the more common answers in this particular format show up big and bold. Got a few people. Looking good. Excellent. So you can log into that anytime. There's a few more of those questions coming as we go along. So please feel free to join in. It gives me some ideas about how you guys are taking the presentation. There's also an option to ask questions, and I'll watch for those as we go through this presentation as well. So the first thing I need to say before we get too far into this, and I was looking through the participant list just a minute ago, and there's a few people on there that already know this. I am not a nutritionist. I'm a veterinarian, and my qualifications to talk about what I'm getting ready to talk about are not as much that I've had a lot of nutritional training or anything like that, but I've seen the wrecks. And that's really what motivates me to talk about what I'm going to talk about today, is that some of the wrecks that we get into relative to nutrition are pretty big and pretty bad. And I've seen those, and I've seen what they do to people and what they do to their ability to stay in the business. And my goal is to try to give people some of the information and an incentive to stay out of the wreck territory. So I'm not a nutritionist. I don't play one on TV. I really enjoy nutrition, and I do things, quite a few things for people that are very close to me, and like family and stuff like that. I do a little bit of practicing the art of nutrition, but I'm not one. And I already told the Ward folks that they need to correct me, and I've already seen that on this, without calling anybody in particular out, on this webinar today, there's people that are far more qualified to talk about nutrition than I am. So when I talk about it later, make sure you offer correction if I'm in need. So with that, here's today's agenda. I'd like to try to make a case for you that there's a need for building resilience and especially in our cow-calf systems. I would argue probably in our agricultural systems in general, but we're going to focus on the cow and the calf today. I'm going to spend quite a bit of time talking about the consequences of thin cows. Like I said, I've seen some wrecks. They come in various forms. Sometimes they're wrecks in the cows themselves. Sometimes we see calf health issues. But running cows too thin has some real consequences. And then I'm going to try to describe some things that I've seen as opportunities. At least we're going to talk about how we might assess opportunities that exist. And basically the summary for today, if you want to listen to this and then decide if you want to come and listen to the recording later, is we have to run cow-calf production very close to the edge, and margins are often very slim. That's a very efficient system, but being close to the edge means that we could fall off, and close to the edge management leaves the door open to some pretty catastrophic losses. So we buy insurance for risks that we don't feel like we can adequately manage, And my case today is that I'm going to try to convince you that maybe we can buy a little nutritional insurance, and why we might need to do that for a cow-calf herd. So, and doing that from a position of knowledge is something that I've actually had Ward Labs help me do in my own little operation. So my definition for resilience, because there's a lot of them out there, but what we're going to be working on today is being able to take a hit and stay in business. So be able to take the punch and keep on going. For me, I've kind of split this into 3 levels when I talk to people that I'm working with. Level 1 is contingency planning. Doesn't cost much other than some time to think about what are the possibilities if the plan doesn't work the way we plan it to. That's relatively easy. It's not easy intellectually or thought. It takes thought to make a good contingency plan, but it does allow for some resilience to be built in the system, because you've already thought about what happens if this doesn't go the way I expect it to. Level 2 is quite a bit more difficult because thin margins make it difficult to build reserves, but leaving some grass in the pasture, some money in the bank. I like this little quote I found online: all days are not the same, save for a rainy day. When you don't work, the savings will work for you. And I think that is very true of our cow-calf systems. And then level 3, the most difficult, I think, especially when we feel pressure to specialize, to become very efficient at one thing in order to maintain margins, is to enhance diversity. As this quote puts it, don't put all your eggs in one basket. I think my grandma told me that a few times too. So when a question for you guys, and this is kind of going to be a topic for the rest of the discussion here, is what word or words come to mind when you see fat cows? This is word association. We're doing psychology now. This is most veterinarians' second favorite pastime. So this is a chance for you to weigh in. I like the first response. Tasty is very good as well. Some people are tracking with something I run across very, very frequently. Very interesting. So as the results kind of keep coming in here, one thing that I run across a lot is that a fat cow, and I didn't define fat for you, I just said fat. So there's lots of different levels of fat we can talk about. But wasted money, spent too much, things like that are very common ideas that come up when we talk about cows that have quite a bit of cover on them. And there's a difference between having really, really fat cows and having cows that have a little to give. So that's what we're going to spend a lot of time on. So that the next question goes to how fat are they? This is a chance for you to tell me a little bit about what you do. Do you routinely condition score individual cows in your herd? Not drive out there and think they're in pretty good shape, or I'm talking about like run them through the chute and laying hands on them, or at least individually assessing a good chunk of the cows in your herd or that you work with. Looks like about 3/4 of people are doing individual. That's really great to hear. Excellent. So the next little section of this presentation is really to try to describe the consequences of thin cows. And I'm going to point out that there are 3 levels of consequences that we can expect from thin cows, cows that have a body condition score of 4 or less. And this is based on a lot of research. If you're interested in reading those papers, I can get them for you. There's work that's been done. Some of it's been done here in Nebraska at the US Mark. There's been quite a bit of work done out of Canada, looking at the impact of body condition on calving outcomes. But the 3 levels that we can expect some challenges from if we have thin cows is we can expect the near-term consequences to be issues with calf health. And I'm going to go through that. In the midterm, we can expect some issues with cow fertility And in the long run, I'm going to try to make the case that we might be able to anticipate some changes that are going to be pretty hard on the long-term function of the cow herd itself. So when we have cows that are losing body condition, there's quite a few things that happen. And in the short term, what happens, especially if those cows are coming up to calving, is that cows that get thin have two important problems that affect the calf in the short term. One that we know of is that thin cows tend to have more trouble with calving. They tend to spend more time. So the time spent in the phase 2 of labor tends to be longer for cows that are body condition score 4 or less. And they tend to have that dystocia, or that prolonged calving, results in calves that are weak. And there's a lot of theories about that. The one that's out there that makes the most sense to me is that calves that spend a lot of time in utero in the process of labor tend to build lactic acid up. So if you've ever worked really hard and you're really sore the next day, that's the same phenomenon that's happening in these weak calves. They're spending too much time in an anaerobic metabolic state because that cow is working hard. Sometimes the placenta starts to detach a bit and those calves are born weak. If calves are born weak, the probability that they're going to jump up and nurse effectively and get an adequate dose of colostrum is much lower. A paper out of Canada showed that calves that are born with a weak suckle, which is a pretty good indicator of their status at birth, if they're born with a weak suckle, they have very, very high likelihood of not getting a good meal of colostrum, like 90%, and I'm quoting off the top of my head, so it's very high. That might not be the exact number, but almost the vast majority of them fail to nurse a good dose of colostrum by 4 hours of age. So the outcome to failure of passive transfer is that we see lots of increased calf illness and death in the short term. And in beef cattle, we don't know as much about the long-term effects of failure of passive transfer, but in dairy cattle, we know that if an animal does not get a good dose of colostrum when it's a calf, it's very likely to experience a lower lifetime productivity and worse health outcomes for its entire life, not just during its calfhood. So in the midterm, loss of condition prior to calving is very difficult to make up, and cows that are thin, body condition score 4 or less, tend to experience a delayed return to estrus. So instead of being what we classically think to be about 30 to 60 days from calving until they return to cyclicity, it might be much longer than that. In some cases, if they're thin enough, it might be indefinite until they achieve a higher body condition. And as you experience delays in return to estrus, if you have a controlled breeding season where the bulls come out, you're going to experience more open cows. At a minimum, you're probably going to see a shift in the breeding distribution. And over time, that shift is going to get worse. Another vicious cycle that often plays a role, especially in the northern plains, where we can have pretty severe winters, is that cows that have too little body condition and are eating feed that's not adequate to meet their needs, or not enough feed to meet their needs, are going to lose that body cover, which plays an important role of not only being a reserve, but of being an insulating barrier between them and the cold temps. And as they lose that insulating fat, it increases their need to shiver to stay warm, which increases maintenance, which makes that inadequate diet even more important to those animals. So it doesn't take as much to get an animal to go from a 4 to a 3 as it does to get her from a 6 to a 5, if that makes sense. Another important vicious cycle that we run into with thin cows is that as those cows lose condition and they go through that prolonged calving or dystocia and make weak calves, if it's cold outside and those calves don't have adequate energy to get up and nurse, not only are they going to miss that colostrum, but they're more likely to succumb to hypothermia, because that colostrum becomes a very important part of maintaining their thermal status in cold temperatures. So we really complicate thin cow outcomes by having those cows in places where it can get cold, or calving them during a colder time of the year. I think this one is really insidious and it sneaks up on people. And it's a consequence I've seen in some herds that kind of routinely run cows thinner than, you know, there's a difference between efficient and too thin. And I've seen this in herds that kind of edge toward the too thin. Is over time, as they struggle with that return to estrus in cows, it takes them longer, or they shift cows' breeding times later into the breeding season, because it takes that extra time to get a cow to return to cyclicity. And there's some really neat work that shows that heifers that are born in the first 21 days of the calving season are more likely to stay in the herd for a longer period of time, and they're more likely themselves to calve in the first 21 days of the breeding season. So over time, what happens is as calving distributions shift toward having more calves later in the calving season, unless something is done to directly counteract that, you can, I'm not going to say this is an absolute 100%, but it strikes me that there's a distinct possibility that we're shifting the cow herd toward a less fertile state, and we start to struggle more with reproductive success based on the fact that we're not giving the animals the time they need to return to estrus. So all these things kind of lead up to this slide right here, which is this is a little story in a form of a little graphic, but the perspective that I've seen in agriculture, but especially in cow-calf production, is that as producers start to feel financial pressure, which seems to be almost ever present here of late, there's always some financial pressure in the system, they increase their efforts to control costs, because in a commodity business, that's really your only option. You have to keep costs down in order to make sure that you can maintain some margin. And if you can effectively control costs, you can manage that financial pressure by maintaining margins. What I've seen, though, in several notable cases that I've worked on where people got into significant trouble with thin cows, is that when nutrition was used as the place to control cost, over time they experienced a gradual erosion of resilience. So basically started to erode the ability of the cow herd or individual cows to be able to cope with things like extra cold winters or cold wet spells. 2 years ago stands out pretty strongly in my mind. Here in Nebraska, we had long stretch of cold weather followed by an incredibly wet, muddy spring, and we saw some significant problems. And a lot of that was because cows going into that were just not carrying enough condition. So that loss of resilience, if you experienced adverse conditions, increases the financial pressure. And if more efforts are made to control costs to cope with that financial pressure, and those efforts continue to erode resilience, you find yourself in a vicious cycle where every effort to control costs makes it more and more difficult to maintain the margin. So basically, the entire point of this presentation is summed up in this slide with the idea that while we need to maintain margins to stay in business, we need to be thinking about the unintended consequence of where we might choose to make the cuts and how those affect the health and productivity in the long haul for our cow herd. This might be a good time if anybody's got some questions. See anything in the chat or the Q&A. Anybody's got questions about this, I'd be happy to entertain those. We're going to switch gears after this a little bit. Just a second.
I didn't see any questions, but I think you will be pleased. Dr. Jim Sprinkle from University of Idaho is on, and he agreed about your slide on the thin body condition score, so you should feel confident in that.
That's good. I'm glad somebody's propping my resolve to continue up. I appreciate that. So you can join and you can ask questions. They'll actually show up here on the screen if you ask them in the Q&A section of the Slido app. I'll go back to the presentation. So Here's some of the things that I thought about when you start looking for the opportunity to build resilience. I think the step one, and this is the contingency planning part of the step, and then we'll talk about step two, which is building some reserves next. But one is you have to know where you are. So condition score and weigh individual cows. I think if I had to choose, I would pick condition scoring over weight, simply because condition gives me an idea of how prepared they are to handle adverse conditions. I can have very large, heavy cows that are still very thin, or I can have relatively small framed cows that don't weigh very much but are carrying plenty of cover. And it's important to separate those things out. I think weight probably has more to do with long-term and choosing cows that fit your environment, which is something we'll talk about here toward the end of this presentation. The second thing that I think is really, really important, and the Ward folks did not ask me to say this, I'm saying it all of my own accord, is you have to know your feed. And I've been involved in several situations that it wasn't a lack of feed that got cows in trouble. It was the fact that there was assumptions made about how good the feed was and what it would do for the cows that were simply not accurate. And this kind of goes in the category for me of weighing cows with my eyeballs. I'm not very good at determining feed quality or its nutritional attributes with my eyes. And I think it's relatively inexpensive insurance to understand what's in your feed and what it will do for the animals that you have available. And sometimes that involves in getting other people that know what they're doing. Nutritionists are very, very helpful with this, especially when it comes to figuring out how to feed to make up for inadequacies in forage especially. And then the third point here is you have to know your system. So you have to match the plan to the production. There's a lot of best management practices mentalities. If you just follow this simple recipe with steps 1 through 5, your cows will be just fine. My experience is that everybody's system differs enough to make some of those plans be pretty painful. Sometimes the expense comes from overfeeding something that isn't needed in that particular system, or it fails to meet the needs, which is even greater expense if it results in compromised health or productivity. So contingency planning, pushing the pencil. So I just want to run through an example, and I'm gonna show you in a second how I did this. But we all buy insurance sometimes because we have to. If we're going to drive a car, we have to buy some insurance. It's required by law. But sometimes we buy it because we don't want to take the risks that's associated with, for instance, health. Healthcare is expensive. I consider it less expensive maybe to buy insurance than to just pay for my healthcare. Maybe that's not a good example today, but we do buy insurance for things that we can't control our risk on. So what I'm wondering is, if I have thin cows, do I need to buy some fat insurance, if you will, and how much will that cost me? So here's the example that I've set out. You could do this with anything. I've chosen corn stalks because here in Nebraska it's relatively common, but if you're feeding stored hay, I would definitely do this because it might be even more important because hay costs a lot more than corn stalks do. But I have a cow herd that maybe has an average body condition score of 4 at weaning. And I wish this was uncommon, but I see a lot of cows that are bona fide body condition score at weaning time. And I'm going to wean those cows on December 1. I'm going to use corn stalk residue to overwinter, and the corn stalks are going to be over with by about March 15. That's especially when farmers around here like to have cows get off their corn stalks. So I'll have to feed, because if I weaned in December, I probably won't calve till about the 1st of May. So I got about 45 days to feed cows. If I want to calve at body condition score 5, that's by insurance, I need to figure out how between December 1 and May 1 to get an entire body condition score on those cows. And I use 5 just because the literature would suggest that at 5, almost all the things we don't like to happen, like long labor, weak calves, failure passive transfer, and long return to estrus, tend to go away somewhere between 4 and 5. So here's how I do nutrition, because I'm not a nutritionist. So I have Brands, which is a program that Iowa State puts together. I have a copy of that I use. It has a feed library in it. I use the book values, which are not always accurate for things like distillers and corn. And I use, depending on what I'm doing, I usually put my forage analysis in for the hay. And then what I do is I try to build simple supplements. So if I see that energy is lacking, in my mind, corn is the ultimate energy source. If protein is lacking, distillers grains is widely available here in Nebraska, or most of the time it is. So I might add a 50-50 mix like I did here. So then what I do is I go over to their intake over here, and I set these numbers over here so that I'm feeding the least amount of the supplement and the most amount of the hay, so that they're consuming 100% of what the program thinks they should. And I'm very, very close to both their net energy and their metabolizable protein. So I'm not very good at coming up with the best case scenario, but this is kind of my rock and bucket way to figure out, will this diet meet their needs, or is it likely to be inadequate? And this gives me an idea if I'm going to be short on energy or protein or a few of the other things. So I try to put the feed costs into the library so that they're accurate. So this number down here, I hope is close. So I put in corn at $3.50. Honestly, I didn't look, I just plugged it in. I put in distillers, I think at $160 a ton. And I put the brome grass in at $100 a ton. So then I go down and I look at a couple of things down here. So I'm looking at 30-day body condition score change. And this is based on the assumption of an Angus type cow. And I'm looking at how much gain or loss there. And then the actual cow, the predicted cow weight gain is right here. So I focus more on body condition than I do on the weight gain, because I think it's a little bit more in line with what my goals are. I see that we have somebody that raised their hand. Corey, I think if you want to unmute, you can. I think. Maybe I can unmute you. Nope. Becker or Hannah, if you can find a way, if he's got a question, if Corey has a question.
I have allowed him to speak. It's not allowing me to unmute him. So
Corey, if you have a question, I think you'll have to unmute yourself, or you can type your question in either the Q&A, the chat box, or you can put it on Slido if you have a question. If you figure out, if you want to ask a question, you unmute, just go ahead and interrupt. I'm going to keep going for right now. So this is basically what I do. This is how I do the little bit of nutrition stuff that I do. And I'll tell you right now that what I'm really aiming for is not so much to build the best diet. My typical use of something like Brands is to try to figure out, have we met the needs of the animal we're trying to feed or not? So I don't have a lot to offer in the form of the best formulations. There's lots of other people that are really skilled in that. This is my example, and you'll be able to see pretty quick that someone with more skills will be able to do a better job of this than probably what I can. So here's what I've come up with. So for the first question that I have about this scenario is, what will happen on corn stalks between December 1st and March 15th to these cows? So the temperatures and wind exposure is kind of built in, like these cows can access a wind break of some kind, and temperatures are going to be pretty close to normal. So this diet of straight corn stalks, this is corn stalk graze, which assumes the cow is going to be able to select her own diet out on corn stalks, and it assumes probably that we're going to give her adequate access, that she won't become limited in her ability to do that. Would suggest that throughout that 105-day period, she is going to lose about just a little bit less than 0.2 of a pound a day, which corresponds to the loss of about a quarter body condition score over the entire 105-day period, which is pretty close to maintenance. I don't know that I'd get too shook about that. There might be someone else that has a different opinion, and I'd welcome that opinion. If average temps happen to be 10 degrees colder for that entire period, we're going to lose about a third of a body condition score over that feeding period. And remember, this is a body condition score for cow running on corn stalks in Nebraska with access to a windbreak. If any one of those assumptions isn't true, these numbers might change pretty dramatically. So the question is, if I've pretty much maintained her on corn stalks, we maintained her at a 4, which isn't where I want her. Can I make it up when I pull her off corn stalks and she's now in her 3rd trimester of her lactation, when her nutrient requirements really start to go up as she builds that calf? Can I make it up from March 15th through May 1? So I've assumed, like I told you, about $100 a ton for decent brome. I've put this in at 5% waste, which would assume that we're feeding a TMR in a bunk. And if that's not true, if you're feeding in a bale feeder or on the ground, you're going to have to increase the waste probably significantly. I saw Dr. Minton was on here. He can tell you a lot about what that looks like, because I think he helped some of the grad students at Missouri do some of the waste work. I figure that's going to cost, I think that should say 202 for feed, which includes the brome. And in brands, what I kind of ended up with when I minimize the amount of supplement and maximize the amount of hay to get them to grow, basically they would need to gain about 2/3 of a body condition score a month in order to get one back. It was going to take about 12 pounds of 50-50 corn DDG mix a day for 45 days on that brome grass to get them to a body condition score 5 by calving time. And that, according to brands, was going to cost about just under $91, $90.45. I can't feed that close, but I'm guessing some people can. So if I'm going to make it up, that's what it's going to take. What if we start earlier and look at what it would cost if we try to put that condition on during the 2nd trimester when cows gain weight much more easily? So my assumption here was that instead of having to put a body condition score on in 45 days, we can put one on over the course of 140 or 105 days. And to do that, we're going to feed 6 pounds of dried distiller's grains on the ground. So I'm assuming 30% waste. So if you feed in bunks or some other way, you can cut the waste down significantly, which would dramatically reduce the cost. If I don't factor in any money at all for corn stalks, that's about 50 cents a day in distiller's grains. And again, 30% of that is waste because we're feeding dry distiller's grains on the ground. And then if we just maintain for the next 45 days, we're not trying to put any weight on because we've already put the body condition, the extra body condition score on. For the next 45 days, we're going to use that same brome with 2 pounds of DDGs, and that's going to cost about $1.94 a day. So the grand total is $137.70. So that means it costs $50 extra, which is not pocket change, to do it this way. There's lots of ways to improve the efficiency of that, but it's $50 a head premium for the insurance plan. So I don't really know if I can recommend that or not. I think that's a decision everybody needs to make on their own. But before you say, nope, there's no way, a couple things I'd really like you to think about. Number one is, how much does it cost to have one sick calf? I don't think we really know the answer to that question, especially on a wide scale, but it's expensive, even just figuring treatment costs alone. Even more importantly, perhaps, is how much does an open cow cost or an early cull? And then, is there another way? Maybe we can buy half a body condition score, or perhaps we could invest in the bunk space needed to feed them in a bunk so that we don't lose 30% of it. We cheapen that overwintering cost quite a bit by doing that. Or maybe there's an entirely different option that I haven't thought of. But I think when you contingency plan, one of the things to bear in mind is part of this example that I haven't showed you is what happens if instead of 10 degrees colder, we have 60 days where it's 20 or 30 degrees colder than average. Or we go through a period of time like we did 2 years ago where we basically had 45 days of rain or really wet conditions, and cows were sloughing body condition like it was their job. What does it cost to get that back? And in some cases, I was seeing people invest upwards or over $4 a day trying to maintain cows, not get it back, but maintain during early lactation because they lost so much. So how do you build in a plan for something that can be that expensive? So here's one of the things I really want to point out is that we got to be really careful as we feed cows. And I think the short-term fix of buying insurance by feeding to a desired body condition score can get us in trouble if we pay more attention to that than the long-term fix, which is to get rid of the risk. It's better to not be at risk than it is to buy insurance to cover it. And one way that I think about eliminating long-term risk in a cow herd is we select for cows that are going to put on adequate body condition score and not give it up because they match closely to the resources that are available on the ranch or in the operation. So we want to select those animals to fit the environment that we're going to ask them to be productive in. And I think the trap here is that if we feed a lot, it can mask or it can give the cows that can't hack the environment a crutch that keeps us from identifying them and makes it more likely that over time we'll select for cows that are actually really good at just using our feed resources to be successful. And that's how we get very, very high input agriculture that doesn't pay back. So I want to make sure that that's clear, because I think we can, and a lot of us collectively have been trapped by building high input cow herds. So, oops, went the wrong way. That is the end of what I have to produce, or to present. If there are any questions, I'd really enjoy some questions and commentary from you all. I've got the Slido Q&A thing up, so if you have questions you want to put in there, you can put them there anonymously. I think you can raise your hand or type things in the Q&A. Oh, there's some things showing up in the chat. Oh, looks like
those are all old. That's from when Corey raised his hand. It was accidental.
Don't get run over. So.
Do you mind putting your contact information up so that if anyone is too shy to ask? Because currently we don't have any questions. But I also had a question for you. I don't use brands personally. So I was wondering what the cost is to that program, or is it free to producers through Iowa State?
It is not free. I am not certain what it costs right now. At one point, if you bought just like the cow module, I think it's like somewhere between $100 and $200 per module. So you can there's a cow module, there's a feedlot module, there's a developing heifer module, et cetera. So there's quite a few different things they can get. So it's not free. And mine might be very out of date. I've had mine for quite a while and they've changed the model. Like the NRCS has been updated. So I probably need to get a new one. Maybe I could make that insurance policy cheaper if I had the up-to-date version. But I think one of the things that I've learned is that it's very valuable to know someone that really knows how to do real nutrition work, not me, not the way I do it. But what I found very useful is to be able to ask the first question, which is, how far is this particular feed stuff going to get me? Which I think most of us can do if we have access to something like that. Where it gets a lot more dicey is how do we fix inadequate feed stuffs? And that's where me being a do-it-yourselfer nutritionist, I've gotten myself and my family into trouble a few times.
So it looks like we have a few questions coming in. So we'll start. Wes says, how often are you doing nutrient analysis on your feedstuffs?
For me, it depends a little bit on what it is. So if it's like a dry hay that's stored inside or otherwise protected pretty well, I'm okay with doing a good sample one time. If it's something that's moisture dependent, like silage, I we can get into a lot of trouble with changes in moisture that we don't expect, either because we add moisture through precipitation or there's just changes in the way it was harvested and put up, especially in, like, I always think about bags as we travel through a bag of silage. If that's something you do, you can have spots in the field that vary widely. And if you don't check frequently, you can have big swings in moisture that really change what you're actually feeding, even though the pounds in the wagon are the same. So I like doing things that are wet more often. And then the stuff that to me is really in the gray zone, and the Ward folks can probably give you more insight on this, or exposed feed. I worry about stuff that's stored outside without a lot of protection. Still, if it's dry hay, I fall into the trap of only doing it once, but I think you can leach quite a bit of nutrition out of those outside stored feed stuff. So might be good to do it more often.
Yes, absolutely agree 100% with everything that you said. The bales stored outside, you can lose a lot of that outside bale due to moisture loss and things like that. So if it's good quality hay, it's worth it to take one good quality sample and store it properly. If it's, grass hay that you harvested opportunistically and it's 4% protein anyways, I wouldn't blame you for leaving it out. So I have another question here for you. How much of a lasting effect, this is from Grady. It says, how much of a lasting effect has the hard winter 2 years ago still had on cows today?
That's a great question, and it's one that's pretty hard to answer, but I suspect that it's quite a bit more than we would give it credit for. I know that the breed up a year ago, based on the preg checks a year ago, for a lot of the vets that I talked to was not very good. There was a lot of open cows that we would not have expected to be there if it had been more of a typical year, which I don't know what a typical year is. And so that kind of stuff leaves a lasting effect. But what always concerns me is that the real lasting effect can come in ways that are really, really hard to see for a long time. So if we start seeing a shift in the calving distribution that pushes our opportunity to pull those really good replacement heifers out, or even to just to make it less likely that if we're using a heifer selection program based on success, that we'll have enough successful animals to replace the ones that are in there. Those are really, really slow. There's big delays. And by the time we actually see those problems, most of the time we don't even associate those with a year like we had 2 years ago. So if something bad happens today, I'm not going to say, well, it was because we had a hard spring in March of 2019 or 2018. I'm going to say, well, what did I do in the last 6 months? And that is a trick that our minds get us caught on quite a bit. There's a couple of questions that have, there's one question here in Slido. What would be the number one thing you would do for nutrition for heifers? I just bought my first 3 registered black Angus heifers that are bred. I think the most important thing to do is make sure you're meeting the needs of those animals. So as they're developing, and heifers are really important to keep up with, because they're not only trying to grow a calf right now, they're also trying to grow themselves still. So they're going to be growing frame and muscle as they also grow that calf. And when they get into the 3rd trimester especially, it is really easy to get behind. And as they come into lactation, it is really, really challenging to keep up, because they have a growth demand, they have a lactational demand, and they usually, depending on when you calve, they're going to be calving in at a time when it might be hard to meet their needs with just forage. So make sure you work from a position of knowledge, know what you're feeding them and what it's worth to them, which might mean you need to talk to somebody that knows more about nutrition so that they can help you meet the needs of those animals. Heifers are also challenging because I'm going to say don't get behind. Don't let them get thin, but don't let them get fat either, because fat heifers, you can have problems with calving as they build fat up in their pelvises. It basically just makes the birth canal smaller. And I don't know what the latest and greatest is, but I've always been taught that if you get too much fat in their udders, that you'll impair long-term milk production. So it's a tightrope walk with heifers. So just be careful and make sure you're meeting their needs, and keep a good eye on them. Any other questions? I don't have any more on Slido for the moment.
I have another question from Wes. It says, where does mineral supplementation fall in on your list of priorities or importance? And I will warn you, I see Del Hardy is listening, and that's her big push. So answer carefully.
This is the universal sign of nose goes. I'm not here's my position on minerals. Cows need minerals, and you should feed them to them somehow. After that, I'm not gonna touch that one with a 10-foot pole. I've seen mineral deficiencies, and those are bad. And I think I don't have as much proof for this, but I've also seen toxicity because people were trying so hard to feed minerals. So another, a big theme today, and I'll just reiterate it one more time: feed from a position of knowledge. So know what you have, know what your animals need, and try to make those things match. Mineral can be very expensive, and feeding mineral to the point of toxicity is even more expensive. So after that, I'm not going to say any more about minerals.
Well, what I would say is, Wes, Adele Hardy, I don't know where you're at, but she does a program out of South Dakota. And if you have questions about minerals, it'd be very worth your while. This past year with COVID, it was online, and she was able to have a toxicologist come on and talk about it. And basically he said, you definitely need to have your minerals under control, because once you have a problem, you're going to cost yourself a lot of money, and it's a lot more difficult to correct, just like these macronutrients that Dr. Vander Ley has been speaking about. So we have another question here from Justin Render, and he said, if you roll out hay and feed silage on the ground, how much waste should you assume? Is that 30% also?
So that's a good question too. So there's quite a bit of work that's been done on waste, and I'm going to misquote if I say too much, but if you're interested, you can send me an email and I'll send you some of the papers that are out there. I'm sure the Ward team has some resources on that as well. But the way I understand some of the work that was done at the University of Missouri a few years ago is that sometimes the waste depends on at least two things. One is how much or how high a quality, or basically palatability of the feed, and then how much you're feeding at a time. So, and then how you're feeding would be a better way to put it. So if you're feeding really low quality hay, pretty much so that they can't eat it all in one day, in either on the ground, which in this case is the question, it's probably quite a bit higher than 50%. So if you're putting enough hay out there that it's going to take them 2 or 3 days to eat it all, if you're just setting bales on the ground or something like that, your waste is going to be pretty high. It drops considerably if you can feed just what they can eat in one day. And what they were really evaluating at Missouri when I was there is different types of feeders, hay feeders, and how they affected waste. So if hay was very palatable and fed in, actually, I think as it became more palatable, like really good alfalfa, it almost didn't matter how they fed it. The waste was very low. So that's what I remember from that research. And you got more to add to that, Becca?
I don't know a lot about waste. That's not actually, I've actually never gotten a question about it, but I'm going to definitely look at those resources. It's very interesting, obviously, that it depends on the forage quality and palatability.
I know that if you're not accounting for waste, you can run out of hay much quicker than you expect to.
Yeah, I think that's a really important piece that I think a lot of times does get left out. Let's see. I don't see any more questions here, but we're coming up on the end. Do you have any more questions on Slido?
I don't see any right now. My email is there. My phone number is there. I'm not a real veterinarian anymore, so I don't answer at 2 in the morning, but you're welcome to call me.
Well, with that, I guess, thank you once again for presenting. We really appreciate it. Some really good insights there. Appreciate you taking the time out of your, busy day and busy professional week to come and talk with us. Yep, I'm going to share the screen. So you were the first in our webinar series. Let's see. So next month, we will have Dr. Woody Lane on October 5th at the same time. So I hope all of you guys come back. Once again, if you had to hop off early, well, I guess you wouldn't be on now, but if you want to rewatch and look at some of the other points that Dr. Vander Ley made in more detail, you're welcome to get on. We're going to be sharing this link. It will be on our YouTube page. I know you also wrote a piece with really the same take-home points for progressive cattle, I believe is where that was at. So you guys are welcome to check that out as well. So once again, we hope that you join us for Dr. Woody Lane, Grazing Quality Forages, Practical Soil Health. And thank you again, Dr. Vander Ley. We really appreciate it and some really good insights there.
Thank you.